Hi everyone, I am Cornelius of Voice Studio East, and this is the 7th installment of the Singing Demystified video series. Today we are going to get started on the topic of vocal registers, but since many of my viewers come from a background of complete vocal technique, it seems suitable to first discuss the similarities and differences between the concept of registers and the concept of modes. A register is a collection of pitches united by being accessible in some particular manner, or being separated from other collections of pitches by some sort of boundary phenomenon, like, for example, a voice crack. The need to switch between registers can be compared to the need for a violinist to switch between strings, which would probably also have been known as registers if not for the fact that strings is a more obvious word to use. Another example of registers can be found in woodwind instruments, where you can alter the pitch within the same register by closing and opening holes with your fingers, but you can also switch to a different register by overblowing the instrument, that is, blowing more forcefully. When it comes to singing, the concept of registers has to do with tonal or biomechanical discontinuities that are less absolute than the type just described, and which often leave it possible to completely avoid the discontinuity by routing around it, so to speak. For this reason, different theorists may enumerate the registers differently, depending on which discontinuities they emphasize and which ones they de-emphasize. The most obvious registration phenomenon in singing is that of voice cracks into falsetto, as seen in yodeling. Starting with a study in 1993, a team of researchers headed by Bernard Roubaud used this phenomenon of voice cracks to create what I think is the most quintessential example of a register-based scheme for categorizing vocal coordinations. They asked 19 subjects to produce glissandos, that is, vocal sirens, with noticeable register transitions, and thereby discovered 4 distinct laryngeal vibratory mechanisms, which are generally known as pulse register or vocal fry, modal or chest voice, falsetto or head voice, and finally whistle register. But as these terms are sometimes used in conflicting ways, Roubaud's team labeled the registers M0, M1, M2, and M3. What makes this system so quintessential is that, while the ranges of these registers overlap, they generally occupy different pitch ranges, and they can unambiguously be ordered from low to high. Thus, if we are making transitions from low to high, lightening the registration, whether gradually or discontinuously, there is one definite path. We might conceivably skip certain mechanisms, but there are no parallel pathways to choose from for different stylistic effects. The progression is strictly linear, much as the strings of a violin are straightforwardly arranged from lowest to highest. The opposite extreme can be seen in still voice training, which speaks of vocal qualities, that is, modes, rather than vocal registers, proclaiming that each quality can be extended across the entire range from lowest to highest, in parallel with the other qualities. Still teachers will grant that certain qualities are generally more suitable higher in pitch than lower down, or vice versa, but there is no basis in the still voice training system for ranking different qualities on the basis of pitch range. Thus, where Roubaud's system is purely a register-based system devoid of mode-oriented thinking, a still system is exactly the inverse, a purely mode-oriented system devoid of any register-based thinking. The 4 vocal modes of complete vocal technique covered in the recently concluded video series are a middle ground between these two extremes, namely, a mode-based system with some attention given to pitch ranges. There is, for example, an overdrive pitch limit, and the CVT app mentions that singers often unintentionally enter reduced density for high notes. While there is no canonical ranking of modes as pertaining to different pitch ranges, we can still plainly see that some modes have an overall higher pitch range than other modes. But while this makes CVT a kind of middle ground between two extremes, it is nevertheless much more mode-oriented than register-oriented. That brings us finally to my own system of vocal registers, which, like CVT, is a kind of middle ground, but leaning in the opposite direction. Like Roubaud's system, I classify vocal techniques into registers rather than modes, but unlike Roubaud, I allow for registers that run more or less in parallel, so that the categorization scheme is not particularly linear. My system does not concern itself with the extremes of pulse register and whistle register, instead ranging entirely in what Robot would identify as M1 and M2. But instead of these two registers, I distinguish 7 registers. Chest register, call register, cry register, mixed voice, pharyngeal voice, falsetto, and head register. As with my CVT series, I intend to cover these registers individually in subsequent videos, but for now, here is a brief overview of the most common registers. Chest register is the first we will discuss, not only because it is the lowest of the 7, but also because it is the most commonly used register for speech. At loud volumes, it becomes very brassy to the point of having a very distinctive buzz in the tone. There's a grief that can't be spoken. There's a pain goes on and on. When sung more softly, it can be harder to identify, but it tends to have a certain warmth, and it allows for a very clear enunciation beyond what is possible in any other register. Most beginners will have no trouble finding chest register, but it may have certain coordination problems. Among these, the two most common are excessive airiness and a lack of twang. Both of these problems can usually be addressed by singing bright, energetic songs and working on vocal function exercises, not too high in pitch. Soaring high above chest register, we have the head register, a whoopy sound used a lot by female classical singers and countertenors, and which, like chest register, is capable of being quite loud. In some systems of classification, this may be regarded as a subtype of falsetto, but I join Manuel Garcia in locating the falsetto between chest register and head register. In pop, the falsetto is usually made bright and breathy, like this. Eternal silence of the sea, I am breathing alive. Whereas in classical, it is strengthened and made clear. Roughly in parallel with falsetto, we have mixed voice, which relies on a bit of compression for a restrained sound, similar to the curbing mode in CVT. Gave you all I had and you tossed it in the trash, you tossed it in the trash, you did. Unlike the CVT curbing mode, however, mixed voice need not be metallic. This, by the way, is another major difference between my register system and the CVT mode system. None of the registers in my system are defined by the presence or absence of metal. Thus, all of them can be performed in neutral, which makes my system able to classify sounds a lot more usefully at lower volumes, where CVT has a tendency to lump together everything quiet under the banner of neutral. Finally, we have call register, which, as the name suggests, is what we use for shouting or calling out. And on this account, it is also the most characteristically belty register. It also runs more or less in parallel with mixed voice and falsetto, but sounds considerably fuller or chestier. Compared to chest register proper, though, it has more distance between the tongue and the palate, created mostly either by lowering the tongue and larynx a bit, or by keeping the tongue and larynx more or less in place while tilting the head back. This increased spaciousness will tend to remove most or even all of the buzzing characteristic of chest register, and it can often feel surprisingly similar to falsetto despite tending to be a lot louder. The distinction between chest register and call register may at a glance seem identical to the distinction in complete vocal technique between edge and overdrive, but there are two key differences. Firstly, as with mixed voice, neither chest register nor call register needs to be metallic, so they can both range all the way from the quietest volumes to the loudest. Secondly, the spaciousness of call register does not preclude twang. Thus, not only can we produce a twanged call register, we can also use it to access a wider variety of vowels. In my life, I'm no longer a child, and I yearn for the truth that you know. The remaining registers, cry register and pharyngeal voice, are less common on account of being generally more difficult to produce for most people. So in the interest of not overcomplicating this video, which is already quite complex enough, let's be frank, they will not be addressed until later in the series. For now, we've reached the end of this overview. If you have any questions, be sure to leave a comment below. Remember to like and subscribe for more content, and as always, thanks for watching.